Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful Wednesday, February 17th, and this is a committee of Agriculture, Senate Committee on Agriculture. And we have a group of people with us this morning to go over the food school meals, universal meals bill, and our food security stuff that we've been working on. And before we get started with them, I wanted to let the committee know that Becca has sent a request asking for what bills that we thought we would get done before crossover. And so I've had Linda put together our food security bill, the universal meals bill, the food residual bills, the bill, residuals on farms, that one. I thought we would try to get Ryan's request done for the ecosystem services, advancing that. And then I've got on the tail end of that is the farm labor housing, and that we talked about yesterday. And I didn't know if there was anything else that any of you think of or thought that we were advancing that I might have overlooked. And so think about it. We can talk at the end of the meeting. Anthony?
This is different, but are we also doing a letter about things money we want to see appropriated? A letter to appropriations?
Well, yes, and some of that Ryan's thing, we're gonna have Michael in and talk with him to see if there was language changes that might have to be done, or if it was just adding money to allow that to occur. But either way, it'll either be a letter to Jane and the Propes, or we may have to make some changes to allow it to happen. But it would be adding to what they're already doing. So the farm labor housing, depending on how we make out, I put that was in conjunction with Housing and Economic Development Committee. So Michael might be able to do something in his housing bill that would advance some of that money toward correcting that issue.
I wondered whether maybe it's part of the universal bill. It's not the same thing, but we've talked about the farm share program, helping people buy into CSAs. And I don't know whether that's something that we would add to our request to appropriations, because it's not really a bill, but it's funding for it's called the farm share program.
That's a program that's already running, but they run out of money.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, we could put that down.
Anthony, are you excuse me, are you understanding that there is money available for that now because of sort of unappropriated COVID funds from the first round, or is it something that's going to have to come out of the general fund?
I'm honestly not sure. I'm really not sure. I just wanted to see us look into it.
Okay.
Yeah. And so Linda, our witnesses, I see Jim's with us. Is Rosie and Faye and Betsy on?
Yes, and so is Trevor Lowell from the Agency of Ag.
Yep. Okay. Well, we'll get started, and I guess I understand that everybody is is happy with what language we have drafted. And so I was wondering if we should have Jim go through any of the changes that he made. Did you make some, Jim, from our last meeting?
I made very minor inconsequential changes, which I'm happy to show you.
Yeah, and I got a note from, I think Betsy, yes, that had reviewed that, and you folks are in agreement with those changes. So you want to run through those for the committee, Jim, so that we're all on the same page?
Sure. Linda, can we co-host here so I can show my screen?
You've been made co-host.
Oh, super. Thank you. Let's see what this is. You there? And share that. Okay. Can people see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Good. Okay. A little bit bigger. And minimize this. Okay. So the only changes were we had language here that is existing law that was not being changed. And I kept it in the first draft just for context. So I've taken that language out to make your bill a bit shorter and just replaced it with asterisks to show text that's unchanged. So that's a change I've made wherever I saw text that was not changing. And then we just clarified in two places that a list, this list here and a list coming up further in the bill includes any or all of the following. So this is trying to seek the highest level of student participation, which may include any or all of these things. So just to clarify, it's everything here. And then likewise, we have that same construction. Oh, somewhere down here. Right here. So again, this is just this is a criteria for awarding grant funding, which may include funding for any or all of the following, just to make that clear. And those are the only changes in the bill.
Well, those are pretty simple, straight up changes. So the group that's with us, we have Rosie. Is Rosie with us? I can't see her, so.
I'm here.
Yeah. Have you talked, Rosie, have you chatted? We're talking too about trying to get you an additional employee over in your division at Ed. Not in this bill, but we're talking down in a different room in regards to that. So have you had an opportunity to look the bill over, the draft over, and could you give us your input in regards to it?
Certainly.
Rosie?
So for the record, Rosie Kruger, I'm the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. So I first will admit to not being as prepared as I normally would like to be for a bill of this magnitude. I've read it twice and I've highlighted a few areas that I think might be problematic and the committee might wish to make some changes. But this is a really significant change to how we do school meals in Vermont. And because of our COVID response and the amount of attention that's required from me to handling all of that and making sure that children continue to be fed as the pandemic drags on, I haven't had the time to really invest in going through every point of this and making sure that we understand all of the impacts. And I also haven't had the opportunity to really discuss all of the impacts with others at the Agency of Education. So there are significant impacts on other aspects of education because we use the free and reduced percentage, the free and reduced meal applications that we collect from households in exchange for providing them free meals. We use that as a metric of student poverty throughout the education system. And the committee's heard me talk about this for the last couple of years, and that's really the big hurdle that we see when it comes to universal meals. And there is a working group working right now at the agency to figure out what we think the best source of that alternative information would be. And I'd really love for the committee to request others at the agency to come in and speak specifically about the impact of moving to universal meals on their programs, because I really can only speak to the impact on child nutrition programs, which is obviously significant. But I know that you all wouldn't want to do things that would unintentionally harm those other programs. And I think it would be really important to fully discuss with them what those impacts would be.
And could you give send Linda some names that we should have in?
Certainly, I can consult with Ted Fisher, who's the agency's legislative affairs person, and see who he would recommend to speak about those other programs. So I think.
Can I, Rosie, just sorry to cut you off, but Mr. Chair, it strikes me that obviously that is important for us to understand if the sort of ripple effects, but I wonder if that's more central to, say, the Education Committee. And I think we would be smart to understand it, but I guess just logistically wonder if that's something for them to focus on in addition to us, but I just throw that out there.
Mostly, I just want to make sure that you understand that I'm speaking from the child nutrition perspective at the Agency of Education, and there are likely lots of other folks impacted or programs impacted at the agency that I just can't speak to today. And so I don't want you to be surprised when other problems potentially arise down the line that I haven't covered today. So that was one piece.
So I guess, yeah, it would be important for Ed to look at that as well, equally as well as us, maybe more important. Yep.
So I think I, of course, need to start by noting that there's obviously significant impacts to the education fund. And again, I'm not going to speak much to those today. I think you all are aware of some of those, but I do want to note that in 2019, AOE did an estimate of the impact of universal meals, and we estimated that it would actually cost about $50 million to the state. And that last year, JFO came up with a similar estimate as well. I think that's very different than Hunger Free Vermont's estimate. I think we can agree that their estimate is a best case scenario and our estimate is a worst case scenario. And the true impact is probably somewhere in between there, but we don't know exactly where that's going to fall. So I just need you all to be aware that the impact on the ed fund and therefore the impact on local property tax rates could be higher than is estimated in some of the materials that have been circulated with this bill. And obviously the administration is really concerned about the rising cost of education. And so again, down the line, others at the agency and in the administration may wish to speak more to the actual education fund impacts of this bill. And
Senator Collmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So can I just ask Faye what the estimate was from Hunger Free Vermont? I'm just trying to keep a note here. And so I'm saying AOE says 50 million impact. What was your estimation?
Sure. For the record, Faye Mack from Hunger Free Vermont. Our Hunger Free Vermont's estimate is around $21 million, looking at data from 2018 and data from 2019. I would respectfully disagree with Rosie that it's the best case scenario. We're trying to offer a sort of higher end realistic scenario that's based on participation rates that we're seeing in schools that are currently using universal school meals. And we're happy to kind of walk through how we've done that. We've also been working with the Joint Fiscal Office. Their estimate came in between AOE and Hunger Free Vermont's last year, around 30 million, I think, 30 to 40. And they're working on a revised fiscal note for this year. So they should have that soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
On this point, is it just a utilization difference? Like AOE says 100% of the students take it. You guys say it's 60%. Is that, I mean, just from my simple understanding, is that where the discrepancy lies?
That's certainly a large part of it. So our estimate assumes that, you know, if you offer the meals for free, eventually all students are going to take advantage of that. Maybe that's not the case, and likely you're not going to get 100% utilization. But if we did have 100% utilization, we'd have to pay for it. So we need to know, you know, the maximum amount of money that the state could be on the hook for. And then the other big difference, I think, in the cost is that we assume that no households would submit free and reduced meal applications, so that the federal reimbursement we would get would be based solely on the number of households who are directly certified for free meals because they participate in 3 Squares Vermont or Reach Up. Versus, I believe the other estimates assume that there was some return of free and reduced meal applications. And so again, you know, probably there would be some amount of return, but we just don't know how much. And we have noted that it is difficult to get households to return meal applications when they're not required to in order to receive the meals for free. So I think those are the major differences. There may have also been some work on trying to identify the cost savings from unpaid meal debt. And then we also looked a little bit at the impacts on things like the severe need rate, additional funds that schools get if they hit a very high free and reduced percentage that we're assuming they're not going to get anymore because they're not going to be able to hit that percentage. So a combination of factors, but the main two, I think, are that utilization rate, and then how much can we get households to return the free and reduced meal application.
Is there some other way to measure the wealth of a community other than by using free and reduced meals? You know, we do that with taxes and other issues. I didn't know, would there be?
There are other ways, and that's what the agency is working on right now, is looking at, for those other programs, are there better ways or other ways that we can collect this data? But for the child nutrition programs, the free and reduced meal application is the only way. And so when we're just looking at the cost to the child nutrition programs, we have to look at the fact that households are not as likely to return those meal applications when the meals are free. So USDA doesn't allow us to say look at tax data, or for the purposes of the school nutrition programs doesn't allow us to look at even census data, which they do allow us to look at in some of the other child nutrition programs. So the meal application is really what costs us money if we don't get those returned.
Yep.
And I know that Hunger Free Vermont has a lot of ideas for how we can push folks to return those applications. And they have run some campaigns with schools that are doing universal meals to try and get those numbers up. But we do see that's kind of all over the board in terms of how successful schools are at getting those applications returned when they go to universal meals. And so it's not something that we're confident saying that we'll absolutely be able to resolve with just kind of a voluntary push campaign. So I think, you know, we have spent a lot of time in past years talking about the overall costs of this. And so I don't want to spend too much more time on that today unless there are specific questions. Certainly, you know, I did some extensive testimony in 2019. I think that I gave a lot of assistance in kind of the background data for figuring out the estimate that JFO has worked on. So, you know, we can refer to those when talking more about costs. But I did want to kind of talk about some other pieces that are sort of new or have newly changed in this bill, which obviously combines two bills that you all were working on last year. And I do want to acknowledge that particularly in the local foods incentive purchasing portion of the bill, that you all have incorporated a lot of changes as a result of our feedback last year. We still feel that this is not the most efficient way to encourage schools to purchase more local products, in that there is a lot of overhead costs associated with the oversight and administration of the program, but it's now a workable program. This is something that I could manage at the Agency of Education. We could implement it. So I appreciate that you've taken that feedback and incorporated it and made this into a workable piece. I did want to highlight a couple of things that you may still want to change. So on page 7, line 6 and 7. So this is where it talks about the first year, which is sort of an easier threshold to get the local foods incentive. In the first year, which I think you intend to start next school year, the grant funds are based on the prior school year meal counts through the National School Lunch Program. So if this went into effect July 1, this would be for school year 21 to 22, and the prior year would be the school year that we're currently in, which is school year 20 to 21. And right now, the vast majority of schools are not operating the National School Lunch Program because of all the USDA waivers. Instead, we're operating the Summer Food Service Program. So if you wanted schools to actually be able to get money through this next year, you should add something in here that says for school year 21 to 22, it could be based on National School Lunch Program or Summer Food Service Program numbers. Just a technical piece to get what I think you're trying to get out of this. Also on page 7, line 20 excludes unique food products as defined in 9 VSA from being counted towards the local foods percentage. And I know there has been a lot of discussion in the committee about this. And I think that one of the reasons this is excluded is last year we raised a lot of concerns about combination foods and how we were going to be auditing that and checking to see, a combination food. I do want to highlight for you that by excluding those unique food products, you're excluding all bread products if the wheat is not Vermont grown. And many schools are purchasing bread from local bakeries. So Red Hen, Maria's Bagels and Berry, a lot of local bagel shops and bakeries are providing bread to school food service programs. And the schools are certainly counting that as part of their local purchases when they're currently talking about how much local purchasing they do. So that's a policy decision for you all to decide whether you want to include bread or not. But I just want to note that by excluding those food products, you definitely excluded bread. And go ahead.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, Chris.
could we get Betsy to comment on that? Because it doesn't sound like what we really mean to do.
Yeah, sure. Betsy, have you looked at that? And I mean, should that, you guys think that should be changed?
Yeah, I can look at it again, and Rosie, maybe you and I can talk. That was based on the experience in Oregon with a similar incentive where once they passed the legislation, all the existing school purchasing be like the equivalent of coffee cup in Vermont. Schools buy a lot of buns and bread for sandwiches from a bakery that doesn't contain any local ingredients. And under the definition with the unique food products, it would make those eligible as local just because they're processed, but it wouldn't lead to any new local purchasing. So we were trying to avoid, Oregon went back and changed the law to correct it. I think what would be interesting is, my assumption is that bakery products would be treated as processed products under that definition. So as long as they had at least 50% Vermont product, they'd be eligible as local. But if there is a bakery that doesn't use any Vermont ingredients, it's just processed in Vermont, then at this point it wouldn't be eligible because we feel like it just wouldn't meet the intent, which is to increase additional local purchasing. You know, schools would just qualify based on some of their existing contracts for bread.
Is this your sense of how some New York schools were at 67% local? Is this part of the definition game that your sense is what's happening there? Or
Well, Vermont, I mean, New York requires 75%, I think, New York ingredients. I think they got to such a high percentage because they have large processors, like Welch's grape juice qualifies. They have a lot of New York milk that all is qualifying. I'm not sure what else falls in that, but they do specifically require New York ingredients in the processed product.
all right, thank you.
So, Rosie, would that work if the processing language was put in there?
Well, so what I was trying to convey to you last year is that I really don't want to be responsible at AOE for deciding whether a product is a local product or not. That's just a level of additional work that we don't really have the understanding or the resources, or, you know, that doesn't make sense for us to do at AOE. Now that you have the local foods definition, now that that has passed last year, my suggestion would be to make use of that and put it on the vendor to meet the, you know, if the vendor is attesting that they meet Vermont's definition of local, then that's on them. And I don't entirely fully understand how the local foods definition law works, but I believe there are some ways of dealing with vendors who are calling their item local that don't actually meet it. And so I guess I would prefer to run it through that and say that if the vendor attests that they meet that definition of local, then the school can consider it to be local and count it towards their threshold. That would be my preferred way of doing it at this point.
So Jim, could you change that some way to go by our definition, and that the vendor would certify that it's locally produced using our former definition?
Yes, so this is only with respect to unique food products, correct?
Yeah, so that if they're supplying a hot lunch, if a vendor's supplying a hot lunch program within Vermont, that they would be using the local criteria that's established in law, and they would certify or be responsible for meeting those conditions.
Okay, yeah, we'll do.
Would that ease it up, Rosie?
I think so. Again, I'm not super familiar with the new local foods law, but my understanding is that you are setting out a criteria for what can be labeled local in Vermont. And so it seems like if a vendor meets that criteria, then it would be appropriate to include them here. I'm not sure if that's the case, if I'm understanding that correctly. I'm not sure that it makes sense to limit it just to the unique food products. It seems to me that it would actually save us some time overall if you just said anything. Yeah. So if it's apples, we're not having to check to see were there any New York apples included in the case of apples, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Chris has a question.
Well, I'm happy to hear from Betsy, but I think, is Trevor, who's on this call, is he from the agency? Maybe he had some insight, since they presumably wrestled through these kinds of questions over there.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide some. I'm not the lead on the local definition, but I've been part of the team. So just prefacing my comments with that. But for the record, Trevor Lowell, I'm the Farm to Institution Program Manager at the Agency of Agriculture. So the unique food product, it requires, well, I guess to the compliance piece, since I think that's really important, the Attorney General's office is actually, their division of consumer protection is actually responsible for making sure that businesses comply with the local definition law. Their approach, given that this is a new change for businesses, is basically to sort of work with them in the first year or so to help them get to that. So I'm not sure, and I can't speak for them as far as how they would go about making sure that certain businesses are in compliance. My understanding is if it was something that was egregious, that they would step in and work with the business or the vendor to make sure that they are in fact in line with that law. The unique food product, it has 3 requirements, and the company would have to meet 2 of them. So the majority of the ingredients, which is 50% of all the products by volume, and that excludes water, would have to be local to Vermont, or the substantial transformation of the ingredients have occurred in Vermont, or the headquarters of the company that manufactures the product is in Vermont. So those baked goods would qualify. I think to Betsy's point, the discussion was around, is there a difference between a Red Hen product and a coffee cup product? And both of those things, under the new definition, would fall into that unique food product category.
Yep. So Betsy?
I'm wondering for baked goods, if there's a, will to make sure that those are included, if it makes sense to just spell out that bakery products would be treated in the definition as a processed product. And then it would require Vermont ingredients, not just the headquarters and processing.
Betsy, Rosie?
I just might push back on the idea that Coffee Cup and Red Hen are, different from the impact on the Vermont economy. And this is not really my area, but from a school's perspective, while Red Hen does purchase, does include some Vermont flour in some of their products, I believe that the products that they're using for schools generally are not necessarily including Vermont flour. And so really you're talking about, there's a different price point, there's a different potential, the product has a different taste and but it's not, there's Vermont employees making the product, it's being distributed around Vermont, it's made in Vermont. I'm not sure that there actually, from the school's perspective, is a huge difference between those 2. And so I think you need to make a policy decision about whether that's something you want to incentivize or not.
Well, I would think that if there's a Vermont company employing Vermont people, from buyers to the delivery guys, and all in between, that you'd have to consider that, or I would think we'd want to consider that as a local business that's helping our economy, and that's where we should be trying to spend our money. Chris?
It might come across, or might be a place to think about the percentages that we're asking schools, because I totally agree. I mean, we've been focused on farms, but at some level we are talking about jobs. That's a very laudable goal. I mean, it's foolish on us to import this stuff, but maybe it speaks to not talking about 20%, but starting to talk about 30%, or trying to figure that out. I don't know.
Yep.
So certainly a lever you've got.
Yeah. well, you better make a note of that, Jim, and maybe, maybe put some language in there on percentages, and when we go back through it, we'll have a discussion. Any ideas? Do you want to use 30 as a trial run, or?
Well, Betsy, do we have any shot in the dark? I mean, if we're more liberal on what we're including, I mean, New York goes to 30, I think. And you know, we talked last year about the idea that what a shame if because it's retroactive, if you land at 29% and you've invested a significant amount of money, but then you get 0 because you're a percentage shy, which is why we came up with tiers. If we're making it easier to qualify and less direct to necessarily food that's grown here, does seem to me to speak to beefing up the percentage.
I will say that, so you had asked AOE for a report on the local foods report that folks, so last year you asked everybody to do a report to the agency about what their estimated percentage of local foods purchases had been. We've put that together. It hasn't hit the clearance process at AOE. I'd hoped that would get to you today, but you should see it in the next couple of days. So that gives you a sense of what folks think they're already doing. And I would tell you that that definitely includes things like bread and most likely includes milk. So you could take a look at that and then decide, you know, where you want to set your thresholds based on that report.
Corey?
I was just gonna say, yeah, why don't we wait for that number and then see what would be a reasonable push to increase it just a little bit, but you know, keep it reasonable. It's already doing 32%. You might as well push to 35. That's my point.
So just leave a blank space there to add in our question mark on the percentages for Jim's perspective. Just leave that a question mark there, and we can discuss that, you know, the next trip around on this. Betsy, did you have something that you wanted to add?
No, I think we can do that. You know, what I did for fluid milk is pick 3, they're independent districts, and look at all their food costs and what percentage was fluid milk, and it was already over 15%. And I think we could do the same with bakery products. Like if schools, you know, what percentage are bakery products that are buying from a Vermont company? And so if the goal is to spur new local purchasing, then that could help also set whatever that percentage could be. So I think we could do a little more work. And I do agree with Senator Pearson that it's a bit of a trade-off of you set a higher threshold and include more products, or you create a tiered system as an on-ramp, but then you've got to be conscious of, you know, the intent of the legislation to increase Vermont purchasing.
Okay, Rosie.
Okay, so then the last thing in the local foods purchasing incentive portion of the bill is at the very end, page 14, line 19, where you're discussing in the first year, there's an appropriation of $500,000 for the local foods incentive grants, and AOE may use up to 60% to retain a contractor to assist with developing and establishing the local foods incentive grant. So thinking about how we would actually do this, the agency already has a grants management system that we would likely use internal folks to program this module into. So I just like a little bit more flexibility there, you know, retain a contractor or otherwise fund costs associated with the implementation of the grant program, just so that we have a little bit more flexibility as to how we do that work. Because it may end up being internal rather than a contractor. So those were my comments on that, that part of the bill. But overall, again, while I think this does involve a lot of sort of administrative cost, it's now a workable program that we we could do if you asked us to do it. Moving on, I just wanted to mention, and I haven't seen a lot of mention of this so far in what the bill does, and I wanted to note for you that it does remove the exemption process for schools, for public schools who decide that they don't want to offer the meals program at all. And you know, the agency doesn't really have a position on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I did want you to note that there are currently, as of last year, there were 3 public schools that were using that exemption process to not offer breakfast or lunch. And those were Elmore School, Wyndham Elementary, and Marion Cross, which is in Norwich. And then there were 2 additional schools who were using that exemption process to not offer breakfast. And those were Dummerston School and Albert Bridge School, which is in Brownsville. And so I just wanted to flag for you that there are some schools who are using that, and they may be concerned to see that go away. It's again a policy decision, and I think, you know, we've seen in the during COVID, you know, we really prioritized making meals available to every child in the state, and really pushing schools to provide those meals. So not necessarily a bad thing to remove that exemption, but again, just wanted you to be aware of that impact.
So how did those schools operate during COVID?
So it's actually, there's been a kind of a variety of how they've reacted to COVID.
Right.
So some of them have actually used the flexibility that we have to operate the summer meals program to offer meals this year. Which we're really excited about. And so we have seen some folks do that. And then I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that Elmore and Wyndham are still just offering milk. And I think that the situation there is these are really small schools without commercial kitchens, and they're pretty far from where they could bring in meals from another school. But I think that's what they're doing right now, but I honestly would need to go double check the records, because folks have been kind of moving back and forth. We had a couple of folks do late starts with getting meals who are now offering meals to all their students. So I'm basing that on what stuff looked like pre-COVID, and that may change after COVID. Folks may have had a good experience offering meals and be more willing to consider that going forward.
Right. I know Elmore's maybe 4 or 5 miles from Morrisville, which they're all in the same school district there. And I should think they'd be able to drive a bus or get a few meals from Morrisville to Elmore. I don't know about the other school district, but that one there, it shouldn't be a problem. And I believe that the Elmore school is a small graded, lower grade school. And I think it's very important that children get off to a good start, not only with their education, but with eating habits and what they're, make a good rounded student. You've got to feed them. Do you think that money, that 500,000 is adequate or too much, or?
The amount for the local foods grant?
Yes.
What we should do is probably run a little bit of analysis. When you figure out your tiering, we should look at what folks reported for this year, and we could compare that to meal counts and see, what would they have gotten, assuming that report was correct, what would they have gotten if they applied for it this year?
Yep, that makes sense. And what about, it's kind of off the bill subject, but not really. Have you been working with anyone in DC to see whether they're going to be promoting their universal meals program out of Washington in the near future? Or
So that's, I mean, that's definitely something for you all to keep in mind, is that there is a lot of pressure nationally to do something. And I don't know that Congress and USDA will be able to act quickly enough to do something for next school year. But I think, you know, the School Nutrition Association nationally has been a really vocal supporter of extending, or of moving to universal meals nationally. And some other major organizations have as well. And there certainly seems to be more momentum and support than there has been in the past. So I don't really know what form that would take, and how the feds would choose to do that. And so, you know, we do want to make sure that we give ourselves some flexibility if that were to happen.
Right.
I think that the way the bill is structured right now, it does allow that flexibility, in that, you know, you're saying kind of provided under the federal programs,
Yeah.
if there are additional costs, charge it to your school budget, to your general fund budget. But that's something to kind of keep in mind, is there could be some pretty substantial changes to the national programs,
Well,
which would be great.
yeah. Well, it would certainly make our life much better, and our children's lives much more healthier, I think. But the part of our thinking was to move this along, was to get ready so that if that did happen, that we had all the ducks in sort of lined up to take advantage of that. And so we talked a lot about that, and we've had universal meals, well, basically since last year, and I think it's all worked out quite well for everybody. And I haven't got a clue what that costs, but I would expect it's been more pricey than a system set up with school in normal circumstances, because you had all that delivery going on, and buses running around with meals in there. And so,
well, the overall cost of that additional service certainly has added cost to the program, but overall, I think the program has been cheaper for the state and local level, because right now the feds are paying for all of the meals. And so that's really one of two huge differences between what you're proposing and what we're doing right now. So if there was a way to keep having the feds pay for all the meals, obviously that would be sort of the best thing from a Vermont taxpayer perspective. And then the other main difference that means that we're not having to face some of the issues that we'd have to face in this bill, is that because of all these special circumstances, we were able to actually carry over all the free and reduced eligibility information from last year to this year. So students who qualified for free and reduced meals last year still qualify for meals this year. Even though everybody's getting them for free, they still have that eligibility status unless they submitted a new application. And that's obviously sort of a one-time thing, with all the COVID waivers and how we're particularly operating the programs right now, that means that we didn't actually have a negative impact on the free and reduced percentages as a metric of student poverty for all the other programs that we use it for. So that allowed us to skip that problem this time around, but that's still something definitely that's going to be a hurdle if we were to do this long term.
so
And again, nationally, like if we were to do this nationally, then U.S. Department of Education would need to figure out how they want everybody to deal with this. And it wouldn't just be Vermont having to figure out how we're going to deal with it individually. So that is another benefit of potential national movement there.
So should we have some kind of a clause in this bill that would allow that to happen again, if we needed to use it?
I'm not sure I
Yeah.
understand what you're proposing.
Well, if you could use last year's numbers for this year to have people qualify, and we didn't have much school this past year, and we certainly aren't getting much, in 21 yet. Why not have a clause in the bill that would allow you to use the figures you've been using for the first year of this program, if we can get this passed for
So
free and
we don't
reduced.
have the authority to do that. The feds tell us how we need to use the free and reduced percentages. So the federal regulations are what has allowed us to carry over last year's eligibility. But we couldn't say, for the purposes of the child nutrition programs, the state can't dictate what information is used. That's something that the feds get to decide. Now, for the purposes of some of the other programs, depending on whether it's a state or federal program, I'm talking about the non-child nutrition programs, there's some potential that you could set what metric would be used. But again, that's where I'd really suggest that you talk to other folks from the agency about the specific impact on their programs.
Yep. Chris?
Rosie, I want to go back to the beginning where we were talking about the need for these applications to, make sure we qualify and maximize federal dollars, which is on all of our minds. And I think you were expressing the concern that if we just make this universal, the motivation drops, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have some schools, though, that plenty of schools. I forget the number, but it's more than a couple.
It's about 70.
70. So have we seen that problem play out there, or I'm interested in figuring out ways around it. I mean, so let me just quickly, have we seen that problem arise there?
We've seen it at some schools. So some schools have figured out ways to really get folks to return their applications, and others really have a problem getting the applications in.
Okay, so it's a bit of an organizing task.
Yeah, and we saw that, I think Burlington is a good example. They were attempting to do a Provision 2 base year this year. Meals were free for everybody, and they couldn't collect enough applications to make it financially work. So they are deciding to switch back over to the summer meals program, which doesn't have any impact on the public or the children accessing the meals, but it's that behind the scenes how the funding works. They just couldn't get people to submit applications. Now, this was a crazy year and there was a lot of difficulty communicating to households. But I think it's sort of intuitive that if the meals are free, it's a lot harder to get a household to share that sensitive personal information about their income.
I want to explore this a little bit because I have kids in Burlington schools. I got the form. My kids actually don't really want school lunch, so we make their lunch. So, and I knew we weren't going to qualify, so I didn't fill it out. I had zero motivation to fill it out. But there's nothing is there anything that prevents the schools from not saying, hey, fill this out, it's free and reduced lunch form, as opposed to say, hey, here's a school food survey, please fill this out. Like, don't we have some flexibility in terms of just a mindset shift that maybe could drive our application rate much higher? Are we really limited to what the form looks like and calling it free and reduced lunch forms, or how much flexibility do we have?
So we're pretty limited in what the form looks like. There's a USDA prototype that we have to follow, and we certainly couldn't change the name and say that it wasn't a free and reduced lunch form. We have some flexibility in how we message around it. And so some of the schools that have been most successful are the ones that say, this helps us do X, Y, and Z. Please help the school by submitting the application, rather than saying, please help your family by submitting the application. And so that's, if we were to go down this route, that would certainly be the tactic that we would encourage. And really, we would put a big emphasis on messaging and saying, this helps at this point the state, and keeps everybody's tax dollars, or keeps everybody's tax rates lower. if you submit the application. But I think you will still see folks who, don't want to share that information. And, in our small schools, you likely know the person who is collecting that application and processing it, and they're somebody that you interact with in your community, and it feels pretty awkward to tell them how much money you make, especially if you feel self-conscious about the amount of money you make.
So there's no good way around it, no easy way around it, or somebody would have already done it.
Did Faye have a?
I know, 30 years ago or more, when we wanted to build a new school, if we got a survey from people in town showing incomes, we would get a much larger grant from, I think it was from USDA or something. And we hired one of our teachers, and what their job was all summer was to go to every household and collect this data that would show our incomes. And I mean, yeah, it was personal information, but the story was, hey, if we don't do this, it's going to cost you a lot more for the next 30 years to pay for that school. And they filled it out. Well, I know today's a lot different than 30 years ago. And so you probably still wouldn't get the information, but I would hope, coming from a small town, I would certainly hope that people have got enough gumption and not worry about, the person looking at the act and then going down to the corner store and talking about it. And maybe we could do something about the school district, having somebody that swears that this is confidential information.
Certainly, I want to emphasize that it is confidential information and that there are strict requirements about sharing the information. It's not widely available within the administration. There's a very limited number of staff members who are even allowed to see the information. So folks shouldn't feel worried about submitting it. It's not something that is shared, and we actually, as part of our administrative review process, we ensure that the information is secure and kept confidential. And that's something that we really put a huge emphasis on. But it's kind of human nature to still be a little bit anxious about sharing that information. And I think that's really what we're struggling with here, is right now we have a carrot to get people to submit that information, and that's a free meal, and we're going to lose that carrot. And so how do we deal with that? And there's not a perfect solution. I know there's a lot of things that we can do to encourage folks to submit the applications, but there's nothing that will force them to do it, and we're not allowed to force them to do it in the federal regulations. So that's...
Okay, Faye?
Thank you, Senator Shar. Do you mind if I just offer a little bit of our perspective on this topic?
Sure.
Rosie's exactly right. Families don't want to provide their personal financial information, and unfortunately they need to, in order for communities to be eligible for different meal programs, for communities, schools to get Title I funding and other kinds of funding. And that's a federal reality. Not giving kids, the application is something that I think we all as the adults in the state can figure out, and not having kids be able to access free meals because they and their families feel shame and stigma around sharing their personal financial information shouldn't be a thing. There shouldn't have to be that kind of carrot. We really actually see the opportunity of moving to universal school meals and as a really exciting opportunity to actually shift the narrative for families around this form. So for most of the schools that would be moving to universal school meals, they would need to collect school meal applications in that first year, like in the story around Burlington that Rosie was sharing. And there's a lot of messaging that can change. You know, it's still the school meal application. And as Rosie said, there's not a lot of flexibility around what that application actually looks like, but there's the ability to message it and say, if everybody in our school fills this out, it's going to be more affordable for us to continue this program. And then after that, schools can collect the household income form, which is what's named in the bill. And then it's totally separate from school meals. It's just a form like your emergency contact form and all the other forms that families fill out. And schools have the authority to make that form mandatory, which they can't do for the school meal application. So there's just, we actually see it as a really exciting opportunity. And the act of working with schools to support them and doing this well is the kind of work that Hunger Free Vermont and other organizations do directly with each school, and can work one-on-one and provide language and materials and all of that. And that's would be our intent, to do that with schools as they're going through the transition. And in other, in Vermont, we have around 70 schools who've been providing universal school meals. In other parts of the country, there are whole cities, New York City, Boston, a few other cities who've been, every school in that city has been providing universal school meals for a long time. And I know in New York City, at least, they reported they really looked into it because they were really worried about this too, because nobody wants to lose the federal funding. And they found no decline in the forms being returned. And so as you move forward in this, if you're, I think it'd be great to hear from other folks within the Agency of Education. We'd also be happy to help connect in with folks from New York or other places who've also had experience with this at a bigger scale too.
Well, that's good. So even in New York City, they've been still filling out their forms and getting them in. Of course, nobody knows their next door neighbor in New York, so they don't care, right?
Well, I think everybody feels, even if you don't know the person who you're giving your financial information to, you still feel like you're sharing personal information with somebody, another person. So I think that's there for all of us, no matter what our incomes are.
Well, and it is working in place in Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Faye, I just want to make sure I understood what you just said. Apart from the school meal application form, you said that schools in Vermont have the authority to require parents to disclose their income?
So schools have the authority to make certain forms mandatory. So like filling out your emergency, your child's emergency contact form. The school meal application cannot be made mandatory. Schools can make an alternative form that collects financial information mandatory. How they enforce that is up to the school. I don't think that they're not going to expel children if they don't fill out the form or something like that, but it helps make it part of that packet of forms that you get as a parent at the start of the year that you fill out. But they are not legally, federally allowed to do that for the school meal application.
I was never aware of that. I had a student go all the way through school. I was never asked how much money I made.
Right. Well, so they don't do that now because they use the school meal application as a proxy.
But I mean, apart from the school meals situation.
Right. Right. So they don't ask they ask the way that schools right now collect financial information about households is through the school meal application. And with universal school meals, that school meal application will eventually go away. And so there's just a different form and you have more flexibility in what's asked on that form. It can be more friendly. It can be more simple. And so you weren't asked, you were asked that just because you received the school meal application and it depended if you gave it back or not.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chris?
So Faye, help me just play this out a little bit. I think the way I hear you describe it is it's two steps. There is this school meal application that would be sort of something we would have to work really hard to get every parent in the state to fill out once. And after we do that, then we shift to a different system. Just help us understand that. Is it A and then B, or you see my question?
Yes, I do. And it's, and Rosie can fill in as well here. This gets into the kind of complex nature of the two different main ways, federal options that schools utilize to embark on universal school meals. For provision 2, which is the one that any school in the state is eligible to use. So that's the one that most of the schools who haven't already gone to universal school meals would use. You start out by having what's called a base year. And in that year, you have to determine the students who are qualified for free or reduced or full pay meals. And those kind of ratios follow through for multiple years. And so schools then are certified to offer universal school meals for a certain number of years. And then they either need to redo that process or they can tap into census data and other data to show that the economic situation in the community hasn't changed significantly and they can continue on. So there's a chance for some communities that every 4 or 5 years, they will be asked to fill out the school meal application, or they may not need to for many, many, many years. What then can happen in the interim is, as Rosie has shared, there are other programs within the education system that rely on knowing kind of poverty rates within the school and how many students are low income. Schools can use the school meal information as that information, but they can also collect the information. And so that's where the alternative form comes in. So for most schools, right, you have year A is a big push to get all the families to fill out a school meal application. And then years beyond that until maybe they need to do that big push again, there's a different form that they can use.
I'm
Chris?
sorry. I do have one. I'm sorry. This is a question for Rosie, and it's probably an impossible question, but I'll ask it anyway. None of us, it's not lost on us what you said the first time you met with us this year, which was take it easy on us. We've had a hell of a year. We've had a hell of a year. Everybody has, but no question, you know, the workload that you've been under and folks that you're working with, that is not lost on us. We also know that before you were the director, you were, I guess, the assistant to the director. There was 2 people doing the work you're doing, and that hasn't happened. That you, I guess, are now just the only person, right?
No, I have a team of a bunch of folks who I supervise. We recoded the assistant director position to somebody who works directly with the schools because I needed an additional person doing that work more than I needed somebody helping me manage the team. So we now have a team of 9. And one of those is a limited service position.
Meaning that position will evaporate?
Yep. That's currently funded with one-time USDA award money that we had from a few years ago from doing well in one of our programs. And that currently is approved through June of 2022.
Okay. Because the chair had talked about us trying to find you money for another staffer. And I guess, I know it's impossible for you to answer, but does that go a long way to making this more digestible? I mean,
Absolutely.
I'm just trying to judge, like, we don't want to set you up to fail, and you probably can't come and ask us for a position. So somewhere in between, I'd love to understand how that would go down, if it would be a tremendous help or just a little bit of a help, you know what I mean?
So one of the critical things to implementing the bill as written is that it includes that additional position. If it didn't include that position, I would be telling you that this is not workable. So obviously that incurs additional cost, and that's again not something that I can particularly comment on. But in terms of, if you want me to do the work that you've laid out in this bill, I absolutely need that position. I think something else that we're thinking about is that, as Faye said, Provision 2 is currently an option for all the schools in the state. I know anecdotally that a number of schools really are dreading going back to charging for meals next year. So I'm expecting that this summer, whether you do anything or not, there will be more schools who would like to establish a Provision 2 base year next year than normally would be looking to establish a base year. So normally we have a few every year. We're able to kind of work that work into our normal workload. So I'm a little bit anxious about this summer and how we're going to get that additional work done. And just to give you a little understanding, for Provision 2, if a school is setting their base year, we have to look at all of their free and reduced meal, or a sample of their free and reduced meal applications, just as if we were doing a full administrative review of that school. So it's one portion of the administrative review. Normally we do administrative reviews of 1/3 of the schools every year. This is a big piece of that we have to do for every school who's in their base year of Provision 2 within the first couple months of the school year. So there's just basically a big push of we actually look at the meal applications themselves and ensure that the person at the school who's responsible for approving those applications has done it correctly. We check all of their records in terms of their benefit issuance, their list of students who are eligible for free and reduced meals, and make sure that they're doing all of that correctly. So there's just a lot of administrative work at the state level associated with schools opting into Provision 2. So, you know, we'll figure out a way to do it, but I am anxious about that increased workload on the team this summer if we're right and a bunch of schools do decide to go ahead on their own and do Provision 2 next year so that they don't have to go back to charging for meals.
Well, we'll try our hardest not to break you.
Well, and schools are getting a tremendous amount of money out of Washington right now, and there's more coming. I would think that, with all this extra money, they ought to be able to feed the students without burdening anybody, really. And if you figure it all out, the same people the ones that pay their children's meals are usually the same ones that pay the most in taxes. And so the same people are going to pay the bill anyways, if you had free meals or not. And when we did this years ago in Troy, that's the way I sold it at town meeting. And hell, we had free meals for years until I left the board, and the school just picked the bill up, and it didn't break anybody, I'll tell you. Anything else for us, Rosie?
I don't have anything else for you. I'm happy to, those 3 notes that I mentioned about specific citations, I'm happy to just send those to Jim directly.
Yeah, good. And you'll send us over to Linda some names, the folks that we might want to hear from? Or?
Linda, I think you should just talk to Ted Fisher, and just he can get you names.
Yeah. Any other questions? We've got another crew coming on here in a few minutes. Any other questions for anyone, committee members, guests, invitees, anything else? We want to make sure Jim gets those updates, and we'll get this. I mean, this is a priority for us to get out, this year. And so we'll get back on it next week and try to get it all in order and move forward from there. So if there are no other questions, I would just want to thank you, Rosie, and Faye and Betsy and everybody to be with us, Trevor. And we'll stop now and get ready for our next group in a few minutes.